Hi everyone, welcome back to the Enlightenment Now series where we're looking at Steven Pinker's book on how much progress humanity has made over the past 250 years. In previous episodes we looked at the tremendous amount of progress made in terms of life expectancy, health, sustenance, global wealth. And in a previous episode we started to look at one of the major challenges to this narrative. What about inequality? Have all these gains been unfairly distributed towards the rich rather than the poor? In this episode we're going to look at another major challenge to the progress narrative, namely its environmental impacts. Have all these booms in population and productivity been made in a sustainable way? And in particular we're going to be looking at climate change. Is all this progress leading humanity off a cliff? So in this chapter, Steven Pinker admits that climate change is a real problem, one that we should be very worried about. But he insists, and this is the kind of main point of the chapter, that environmental problems, like other problems, are solvable given the right knowledge. This is the spirit of the Enlightenment, of reason and science to solve all our problems. Now the question is, why wouldn't you believe this? So Pinker is kind of rallying against a tendency that he sees within the traditional environmentalist movement, which is to catastrophize. So he looks at people who prophesize that population growth would bring on the apocalypse, something that hasn't happened. And the reason it hasn't happened is because as countries have developed, people on average have had less children, so we're expecting the world's population to kind of reach its peak somewhere along sort of 10 and 11 billion. Other kind of doomsday prophecies were predictions that we run out of oil or various other resources. Again, it doesn't look like they turn out to be true. So Pinker has this kind of faith that there's nothing unique about environmental problems. We'll find ways to solve them when there's enough will to do so, and through creative technological solutions. And what he kind of stresses is this idea that we shouldn't ever expect to get to this nice, sustainable stage where we're in harmony with our environment. That's just not how humanity and progress work, according to Pinker. He gives the example of how food technologies enabled greater population growth, but then that created shortages which spurned on the need for better food technologies, which eventually worked, but then again spurned on greater population growth, and so on and so forth. Pinker's view of progress is that rather than things being sustainable, we create solutions to problems which admittedly solve those problems, but then create new ones that we have to then create solutions for. And this is a process that never really ends. It seems like humanity is always on the edge of disaster, which in a sense they are if they don't solve the problems that they've created. But this is the kind of ongoing dynamism that Pinker champions. So even though things look very unstable from a certain point of view, according to Pinker, we should embrace this dynamism. And he backs up this kind of environmental optimism with looking at how progress has already been made in very many respects in terms of the environment. He points towards a finding that as nations get richer, they tend to care more about environmental issues. Now this is very similar to what we saw in the inequality chapter, which is as nations get richer, they tend to invest more in social spending. They actually tend to become more equal with greater productivity. And we can see the same for various issues in the environmental movement: deforestation, air pollution, oil spills, the conservation of natural habitats, the healing of the ozone layer. Decreases in these major environmental problems have occurred, the richer nations have begun. So Pinker encourages us to not be sort of down on economic growth as a bringer of environmental disaster, but actually more of a liberator as the bringer of environmental awareness. In other words, with more resources, we have more ability to do stuff about these environmental problems, even if we have created many of them ourselves. He also notes that the world is steadily dematerializing. So an intuitive way to think about this is just think of all that material stuff that you might have had earlier on in your life, like VHS tapes, DVDs, CD collections, that you just don't simply have anymore. The amount that has been reduced to one mobile phone in our pockets is quite stark, really. Pinker kind of almost jokes that we've reached peak paper, peak car, and peak stuff instead of things like peak oil that environmentalists have traditionally spoken about. But he means this jest in quite a real sense, that we're moving towards what many technologists call a soft world, one with much less material infrastructure and much more sort of digital information, which generally has a less negative impact on the environment. So is that all a good story for the environment? Well, not quite, and that's what climate change is all about. I think we can accept everything Pinker has said so far while still acknowledging that climate change is an altogether different, bigger and more wicked problem than the environmental issues that he speaks about at the beginning of the chapter. And Pinker himself admits this. He says that keeping the rise in global temperatures down to 1.2 to 1.5 or 2 degrees is daunting. As a challenge, he notes that fossil fuels provide 86% of the world's energy, powering almost every car, truck, train, plane, ship, tractor, furnace and factory on the planet, together with most of its electricity plants. Humanity, according to Pinker, has never faced a problem like it. Okay, so how do we solve it? Pinker does propose an answer to this question, which he calls deep decarbonisation, and it involves, in the main, two things. First, a political solution in terms of a carbon tax or carbon credits, effectively charging people or companies for the carbon that they put into the atmosphere. Pinker notes that without carbon pricing, fossil fuels, which are uniquely abundant, portable and energy dense, have too great an advantage over the alternatives. And this is a political move that almost every economist and activist and climate scientist agrees on. So far so good. The second part of Pinker's strategy is a bit more controversial. It involves nuclear power and a mass rollout of nuclear energy given new technology. So he argues this is the only realistic alternative to fossil fuels that we have, and a prospect that far outweighs the risks and costs commonly associated with nuclear power. Pinker notes we need other technological breakthroughs as well, batteries to store the intermittent energy from renewables, smart grids, the decarbonisation of various industries and products such as cement, fertilizer, steel production, and also methods of capturing and storing carbon dioxide. So how should we take these somewhat uncontroversial and to some extent controversial solutions that Pinker proposes? Is this, no matter how hard climate change a problem is to solve, is this something we should be content with? Pinker himself notes that even if the deep decarbonisation strategies he outlines happen, we shouldn't rest content with them as a full-blown solution to climate change. He says, even with fair winds and flowing seas, the effort needed to prevent climate change is immense. So we need these political innovations such as carbon pricing. We need these technological innovations in terms of nuclear power and other energy technologies, but they are unknowns, both political and technological. They may not happen, or they may not happen soon enough. Of course, this doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Pinker himself normally shies away from political actions, but says what we need is more activism, legislation, regulation, treaties, and technological innovation. That's what's happened, he says, in the past for solving many of our environmental issues, and that's what we need going on into the future. But he recognizes that this is a risky strategy, that we need a backup option. And this is where climate engineering for Pinker comes in. He outlines what he sees as a moderate, responsive and temporary forms of geoengineering, which, if implemented now with existing technologies, could actually prevent some of the major catastrophic scenarios that climate scientists outline when it comes to climate change. The question is, are there other options? Do we have to rest content with this incredibly risky form of climate engineering as a plan B? Could we create a plan A, which is far less risky, potentially much more radical, one that doesn't rely on technological breakthroughs or various other risks to make sure it works? And that's what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this video. So although almost everyone agrees that carbon pricing is a good idea, that green technologies are a good idea, that doesn't necessarily mean we should rest content with these solutions to solve climate change, because they might just not work. Either they might not work quick enough, or they might not happen at all. And a number of environmentalists, in particular those in the degrowth movement or the steady growth movement, argue that we shouldn't wait to see if this combination of solutions work. We can instead act now, we can act more radically. And they argue what we need to do is actually rapidly slow down our productivity and consumption, the actual activities that are producing greenhouse gases. And indeed, if we are going to do this, we need to do it in a way that is fair. So particularly, we need to have mass redistribution of wealth and other resources to from rich to poor nations, so that poorer nations don't get unfairly harmed by these slowdown of the economy. And we also need a greater investment in public goods in all nations, so that the disadvantaged members, or even in rich nations, don't disbenefit from this unfairly either. So the logic of this idea is fairly simple. It's this idea that, well, we've got enough stuff already. If that's what's causing the problem, the production of more and more stuff, why don't we slow that down, or stop it altogether, or reverse that trend, and make sure we distribute all the stuff we've got already more fairly. Now, Pinker and many other self-described eco-modernists hate this idea. To them, this seems far too politically radical, and therefore not just unrealistic, but also potentially dangerous, threatening the kind of all the progress we've made, but also the political stability that comes with that. So, for example, in the chapter, Pinker kind of mocks the social and climate activist Naomi Klein, who wants to solve climate change through abolishing free markets, through restructuring the global economy, and remaking our political system. Pinker says, why do we need to do that if we can solve it through a combination of what he thinks is good, which is things like social prosperity, wisely regulated markets, international governments, and investments in science and technology? Well, I think the answer is quite obvious why we might want to do that, which is that desperate times call for desperate measures. The problem of climate change is a uniquely wicked and terrifying one. So the reason why many environmentalists are calling for a radical political solution to climate change rather than just a radical technological solution is that it's potentially more risky to wait for the technological backup solution than to do something quite radical in terms of the political sphere right now. Pinker's happy to wait to see whether a combination of decarbonisation and green technology can solve the problem with a backup of geoengineering. Other people are not willing to take that risk. Other people are happy to make big political risks now to prevent that scenario. Pinker isn't happy making those political risks. He sees that as risking the very fabric of structure and society and progress that he thinks has been so fantastic and wonderful, and we should all be so grateful for. I think this kind of gets to the heart of an issue that runs through Enlightenment Now. It seems that for Pinker, liberalism, political liberalism, and economic growth is the only way humanity has found to make progress throughout its history, and the only way in which it ever will. If we mess with that, we risk disaster, according to Pinker, such as the examples of modern communism show. And the book goes at length to show that we've never had it so good. Any alternatives that we can think of to political liberalism and economic growth are doomed to failure and going to make things much worse. Now, I'm not sure things are quite as black and white as this. It seems to me that as we have made all this progress, as we continue to grow economically, new possibilities present themselves. So, for example, it's possible that countries like France or Sweden can redistribute a vast amount more of their GDP on economic growth than is seen sort of viable within the context of the US or the UK. So I think in a similar way, it might be that with the newfound prosperity we have, we can explore in new ways how to combat the economic productivity that is causing climate change in ways that Pinker just doesn't really even want to consider. So my kind of take home from this chapter is, although what Pinker says is very reasonable, I think he's willing to risk quite a lot on a political system that he sees cannot be changed. And I think it would, in facing a problem such as climate change, in times such as this, we might actually have to take that risk, or at least look at what that risk entails.